PHP exception handling. All sorts of things could go wrong in your code that have nothing to do with syntactical errors. In other words, runtime exceptions. So in this nugget, we're going to talk about throwing and catching exceptions. It looks a lot like the Java model if you have any background in Java. It's quite simple. You're going to have a chunk of code that can possibly throw an exception and a corresponding catch block that's going to handle that exception if it does get thrown. Then we're going to talk about the exception class. There's actually a built-in PHP exception class that's defined, and you can even create custom exception handling built on that class. So we will create our own exception class built on the generic exception class. Then we'll talk about default exception functions. You can have in your PHP code a default function that will get executed in case you have some kind of unhandled exception. And then the last thing we'll talk about is error reporting. We want to do this for security reasons. So let's first of all get started with throwing and catching exceptions. You can explicitly throw exceptions in your code and then use try-catch blocks to handle those exceptions. One example might be if you're trying to connect to a database. Maybe you accidentally provide the wrong database string. Well, instead of just relying on PHP to generate this fatal error, you can catch the exception and then display something meaningful to the browser or the command line. Let me show you what I mean. Let's assume that we have a function called getLicense, and this is going to help us get a driver's license. Okay, so in this function we might pass in an age. I'll just say $A for age. And we might have an if statement in here saying, well, if my $A is less than 16, then we're going to throw a new exception. Whenever we throw an exception, we can provide a string, and that will actually be displayed on the command line. Or if you provide proper handling, you can also display it in the browser. So in this exception here, we're going to say you must be at least 16 to drive. Okay, so we have our exception that's thrown, but it's not actually handled. So let's try to execute this code. Let's say $age is equal to 12. Yes, we have a 12-year-old that's trying to get a driver's license. That's a little scary. Okay, so now we say get license, pass in the age. Let's see what happens. We save this and go to our browser and refresh, and nothing shows up. In fact, if I right-click on here and view source, nothing shows up there either. I'm left in the dark. It's really hard to debug this. If we execute this on the command line, then we get a little bit more information. So I'm going to go to my command line. I'm in the correct directory here. My file name is called exceptions.php. In fact, I'll just show you that it is here. Okay, so now to execute this on the command line, we simply say php-f and then the file name. Okay, look at this. We have an uncaught exception. It is of type exception. That's just a generic built-in class we've got. And here's the message. You must be at least 16 to drive. And here it provided the stack trace. It also told us what line number it occurred on and what file it occurred in. Well, this is great and all, but I'd actually like to be able to splash something to the screen to give us more of a hint so we don't have to go to the command line. So let's actually handle this exception. Now, it's this line of code, this getLicense, that actually called the function that threw the exception. So we're going to put this line right here inside of a try block. See how I have my curly braces? Anytime you have a try, you're going to have a corresponding catch block. The catch takes as its argument an exception. So we say exception. Once again, this is a generic built-in class and a variable that represents an object of type exception. Now, inside of this catch block is where we can print something out. So we might want to echo out $E, use our arrow operator, and this exception class has a built-in function called getMessage. It gives us interesting information. Now I'll show you the whole class definition for exception in just a moment so you can see all the functions available to you. Whenever we have a try-catch block, all it's simply doing is it's trying to execute whatever is inside of these curly braces. If for some reason an exception is thrown, then it goes to the catch section that has the correct type of exception. We can have multiple catch blocks, and they can all be all different types of exceptions. If there isn't the correct kind of catch block, then it will throw a fatal error. So let's save this again and refresh it in our browser. There we go. A little bit more meaningful information here. Now I want to emphasize how the flow of control works. Down here, if I have some code, then this will get executed. If I had a statement inside of the try block after the code that threw the exception, then that code would never be executed. For example, if I said echo hello, well, this line of code here threw the exception. So immediately it jumps down to the catch block. So hello is never printed out. Let's save it. I just want to prove to you what I'm talking about. Okay, there's our goodbye. A minute ago I told you that we'd look at this exception class. So let's take a closer look at the method signatures for that class. Remember, this is a built-in class with PHP 5. There's 4 attributes. There's the message, and so the default message is unknown exception. Every exception has a numeric code associated with it. This defaults to 0. What's cool about this is that you can take this generic exception class and you can subclass it. And you can give different codes for different types of exceptions. That makes it easy to read when you're logging errors. We also have the file name that the exception occurred in, as well as the line number. You should recognize this function. This is the constructor. And then we have several get functions. We have get message, get code, get file, line. We can also get the trace message and the trace as string, so it's in a human readable format. Then there's also this magic function. We call it magic because it starts with a double underscore called toString. So if you were to just echo out or print your $E, which represents the exception object, it would display everything about that exception, the message, code, file, line, and so on. Now that you know what this exception looks like, we can actually create our own custom class that subclasses this. So I'm just going to open up a new file, and I'll say class, we'll just call it my exception. And of course, you'd want to have a constructor. And then we can override the message and the code. For example, I might say that the message is equal to, this is my custom exception. And we might make the code be 4 instead of 0. Now remember how to make our subclass call the constructor from the superclass? We simply say parent, colon, colon, double underscore, construct. And then we pass in the message and the code. We can create our own custom functions in here as well. For example, I'll create a function called handle problem. And then some useful code would go in here. For example, if this was dealing with database issues, we could perform some logging in here into a file. Or we might want to provide some alternate connect string. Okay, but for right now, I'll just put some stub code in there, and I'll just say echo in handle problem function. Now, I'm going to take my code here. I'm going to cut it. I'm actually going to put it into our original code, just so we don't have to be flipping back and forth between files. Now, ultimately, you want to have your class code separated out into a separate file. Okay, so right up here, I'll put in my class code. And inside of my function here, I can explicitly throw my exception. So here I'm just going to change it like that. Now make sure that you catch the appropriate exception down here. Now, before we save this, let's closely look at our code. Does everything look okay? Remember how we said my exception is an extension of the exception class? So we do need to say extends exception. Now, let's save it and refresh in our browser. Okay, good. That's working. So inside of our catch block here, we can also use $E and invoke this custom function that we just created up here. Let's save and test it again. Looks great. Let's go back to our code for just a moment. And you'll see here that when we threw our exception, we actually passed in a string, which really isn't necessary because if we leave this blank, it's actually going to default to this string up here. Now I'd like to give this string a meaningful message, so this is where I'm going to change the string to say, you must be at least 16 to drive. Now, so we save this, and now we can check this in our browser. Okay, works wonderfully. Now back to our code. The next thing I want to show you is how to create yet another exception class that extends exception. And once we create that, I'll show you how to explicitly throw it, and then how to create another catch block for that particular exception. Okay, so the easiest way to do that is to take this existing class, copy it, and tweak it just a little bit. So here I'm just going to add the class right here. And I will not forget my closing curly brace. And I'll call this exception, we'll call this age exception. And what this exception is going to do is it's going to be thrown if the age is not an integer and if it's not between 0 and, let's say, 130. I don't know too many people who are older than 130, and they really shouldn't be driving anyway. Okay, so in our default constructor message, we'll say here, age must be between 0 and 130. We should really say an integer between 0 and 130. And let's give this a different code. I'm arbitrarily choosing the number 5 just to differentiate these codes from each other. And of course, we want it to call the parent constructor. So under what condition is this actually going to get thrown? Well, we're going to have an if statement in here. We can say in here, if not is underscore int, and we're checking $A. If this condition is true, then we're going to throw the exception. And we also want to concatenate some OR statements in here. For example, we want to say, or age is less than 0. Make sure that you have parentheses in the proper location. I need to put parentheses around this whole thing for the if statement. And we also want to say, or $A is greater than 130. So if this condition is true, then we want to throw our new type of exception. So we simply say, throw new age exception. Okay, so once our new age exception is thrown, what actually happens? Well, this statement right here calls the code that throws the exception, and then we just go down to the appropriate catch block, which we don't have yet. The only catch block we have right now is for my exception. So we can put an additional catch block right here. We can say catch age exception. And it's okay to give it the same variable name as this guy right up here because they're all contained within a local scope. So now we can go like this. We can echo out $E, get message. Let's try to actually throw some exceptions. You'll see that the age right now is 12, which is still going to throw our old type of exception. Now, if we change this to be 12.5, which exception is going to be thrown? Well, if you look at our if logic, it's checking first to see if the age exception is being violated. So it will throw the age exception And once this handler catches it, it never reaches this code over here, never reaches that catch block. It actually just prints goodbye. Let me show you. We save this and go to our browser and refresh. Okay, age must be an integer between 0 and 130. So we go back to our code. Now, if you wanted both of your exceptions to be able to be caught, what you could do is create separate try-catch blocks. For example, you would have a try-catch for the first condition, and then another try-catch for the second condition. Let's just bring it back to an integer and refresh just to make sure that our old exception is working. Refresh that. Works wonderfully. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is default exception handlers. Going back to our code, let's assume that we have just a generic exception that's getting thrown. In fact, I'll just put some basic code right here that just says throw new exception. So the way this logic works is no matter what, we know our exception is going to get thrown. Now, do we have an appropriate handler for this? No, we don't. Now, let's go ahead and run this. Let's do it in our command prompt. And we'll just say php-f exceptions.php, see what kind of fatal error we get. Okay, uncaught exception, called exception, thrown. It tells us the file name and the line number. Well, we don't have any default exception handler in our code, so let me show you how to create one of those. What you want to do is actually two steps. You're first of all going to declare a function. I'll declare it right down here. Call it anything you want to. I'll call my function catchIt. And inside of my code, I want to make sure that there's exactly one parameter that represents the exception that's thrown. I'll just call mine $e. In our code, I can put a little echo statement saying that we are in the catchIt function. In the real world, you would put some meaningful code to do some default catching, maybe some logging to a file somewhere. And you can also use those built-in functions that belong to the exception class. For example, we can say echo $e, do the arrow, and get message. So that's the first step. We create our function. Then the next step is we want to call the function called set exception handler. Make sure that you call this code after the function is declared up here, somewhere before it. Okay, and so inside of those parentheses, you want to have the name, in quotes, of your function. So now when I save this and refresh, you'll see the difference in behavior. We are in the catchIt function. Now it didn't print out a corresponding message because you'll see that when we threw it, we didn't pass in any string. See right down here? It was blank. We can put some meaningful string or non-meaningful string in here and test it again. Great. I just want to emphasize that you declare your function before you call the setExceptionHandler function down here. You know, one tool that I find really useful for developers, but not in a production environment, is the showSource function. And what it does is it actually shows the source code for a whole file. And all you need to do is pass it the name of a file. Okay, so in our code here, you know already that our catchIt function is getting invoked. So what we could do in our code here is call the showSource function, and we can pass in this $e is the exception. Remember, there's a built-in method called getFile. Remember, that belongs to the exception class. If we also want to print to the screen, maybe a new line character with the BR tag there, as well as maybe $e and the line number that the problem is on. And one more BR tag, just so it looks nice, just like that. So now we can go ahead and save this and refresh. Take a look at that. Okay, so it tells us, hey, there's a problem on line 38. You'll see that this is very useful for developers because you can immediately see the actual code. However, it's very dangerous in a production environment. Let's go in here and clean up this BR tag as well. There we go. And the next thing I want to talk about is error reporting. By default, error reporting is enabled. In other words, when you run some code, either from the browser or on the command line, and an exception is thrown, you can see what's going on. You get some output. You get error reporting. So you can actually turn off error reporting, and that's a recommended practice if you're in a production environment. So let's go back to our code, and let's comment out these lines right here. And at the beginning of your code, somewhere in your file, I'm just going to put it right up here, you can set the error reporting level. And you do that either by passing in a number or by passing in the corresponding string, which is just a constant representing that number. Now in just a moment I'll show you the documentation that explains what all those numbers mean. But what you need to do is simply say error underscore reporting, and then the number 0, which means turn off error reporting. So now hackers are going to have much more difficulty trying to send in bogus pieces of information to maybe a form PHP file and getting error messages that might let them hack further into your system. Let me take you to the documentation. We're just going to go to Google and type in PHP error reporting, and you'll see that it's in the manual right there. And you just scroll down here, and this gives us all of the different levels of error reporting. So you'll see here the constants here and the values here. It's recommended that you use the constants for forwards compatibility and backwards compatibility. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see how this is used. For example, this turns off all error reporting. If you want to report simple running errors, this one says, hey, we want to report errors, warnings, and parsing errors. And this down here turns on error reporting for all of these. You would only want to use that in a development environment, never in a production environment. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. I first of all showed you how to throw and catch exceptions. Remember, you're going to have the keyword throw followed by curly braces and then some code that's going to possibly throw your exceptions. And then you'll have the keyword catch, and then some more curly braces, and the code that's going to handle the exception. Now remember, you can have more than one catch block, each with its own specific type of exception. We have our built-in exception class, and it has some useful functions in there, such as get message, get file, get line. So you can find out some really meaningful information, and if you want, you can log all that information to a log file. Then we looked at custom exception handling. Remember that all you need to do is make your class extend the exception class. Then once you extend that class, then you can use any of the built-in functions, and you can add any more functions that are customized. We have the default exception function. You set that by calling the setExceptionHandler function, passing in the name of your function that you want executed in case exceptions are not handled. Then we had error reporting. This is where you can set the error reporting level in your PHP code. Now if you want to turn off error reporting, then set it to 0. Remember, the function is error underscore reporting. So you can either pass in a number or a constant, depending on your preference. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.